many years pass after Joseph has died, and the people of Israel grow in number. They grow into a proper nation. They are experiencing part of the blessing that God has promised to Abraham. Remember, God has promised to Abraham a people, descendants, nations, who will live under God's rule, under God's blessing, under God's protection and provision in God's place in the land that God has promised. So part of that is being fulfilled. The people are multiplying, and of course this is part of the Great Commission, the great mandate of creation, isn't it? To multiply and to fill the earth, for Israel to fill the land. So they are multiplying, but they are in exile. They are outside of the land. And time goes by, and the Egyptians that knew and were blessed by Joseph's presence in the land, the Pharaoh that had ruled at that time is long gone, and there is a new Pharaoh, a new king on the throne, and he cannot remember Joseph. I think not just the sense that he wasn't physically present there, obviously they weren't, but the memory, the news, the history of what had happened at that time seems to have been, for whatever reason, lost. It's scrubbed out. Of course, it will have been passed down amongst the Israelites, but it's not there in the records of Egypt. And that would make sense, reflect some of the things that we see in Egyptian history, where there's been changes of dynasty, power changes, more than just this guy doesn't remember, doesn't know about it. It's lost from the consciousness of the people. But the Israelites are there and present in the land. Well, Pharaoh becomes fearful of these growing numbers of Semitic people living in actually one of the most fertile and prosperous parts of the land, up in Goshen, up in the delta region of Egypt. And so he becomes afraid that they are going to become so powerful that they will overthrow the Egyptians. That again makes sense, doesn't it? These changing of dynasties, and there have been different tribes and ethnic groups that have moved in, and the power has swung between them. So Pharaoh does a couple of things. One, he enslaves the Israelites into forced labor, building some of his store cities and strongholds and treasure houses. And two, he decides that he's going to wipe out these people. He's going to put an end to them. So the adults and the girls will be enslaved, but there's going to be an ethnic cleansing, a genocide. And the way that he does that is he commands that the baby boys are to be thrown into the River Nile. They are to be killed. That's strikingly horrific, isn't it? Actually, God thwarts that plan. Just as a side point today, when we see the evil of abortion, we see that same evil from long ago, the willingness to wipe out generations of babies in the womb, especially those who don't fit certain criteria. And in some countries, we've seen a kind of mirror or reverse of this, where there's a great risk that if baby girls are born, we particularly saw this with the one child rule in China, then their lives are at risk because a boy is desired.
The first wave of like, let's say depression.
But we're also meant to see, just as when Herod sends his men into Bethlehem to kill the infants, but there is actually one particular baby who's at risk because there's a family and they already have an older son and an older daughter. Their names are Aaron and Miriam, and they have a new baby, and for as long as possible they try to hide the baby in the house, but they realize that the baby is getting louder. It's harder to keep it secret, so they, in desperation, they try something, something that seems ridiculously futile, but we will try anything. And so they make a little basket, and they pitch it with tar, and they put the baby in the basket and they take it down to the River Nile amongst the reeds and hide it there. Some more little observations in terms of links in the story. The basket is, the word given to it is actually an ark. They make an ark. The ark that Noah had built had also been pitched with tar. And they take the baby in this basket down to the very waters of death, the place where the Egyptians want the baby to be drowned, to be murdered. He will be in the waters of death, but kept safe in an ark. And they leave his sister Miriam to keep watch. Well, it's the place where the Pharaoh's daughter, one of the Egyptian princesses, comes to bathe. And she finds this baby. And she decides to take him in. Miriam comes forward and says, I can find you someone to care for him. He's recognised as a Hebrew baby, but he's going to be brought up in the palace. And he's going to be called Moses. It has that idea of being drawn out of the water. Well, Moses grows up and spends the first 40 years of his life growing up as a prince in Egypt. And then we're told that one day he goes out to see what is happening with his people, with the Israelites. He wants to find his brothers. He sees an Egyptian beat him a Hebrew slave, and he intervenes and kills the Egyptian, hides the body, hopes that he's not being seen. But then he returns another time and sees two Hebrews, two Israelites fighting, and he seeks to intervene. And their response is, "You're going to kill one of us like you killed the Egyptian." And Moses realizes that he has been seen, and so he flees. He runs away into exile, into the desert, the wilderness, the Sinai Peninsula area. There he will arrive at a well, he will meet a family, he will meet his wife there, bit of a theme developing. And be brought into a family, he will serve as a shepherd in that family for 40 years. And for 40 years, he will then, one day whilst he is out with the flocks, he sees something, and it's odd. There is a bush that is on fire. Now that's not the odd thing. Apparently these bushes will sort of spontaneously combust out in the wilderness, out in the heat, as they dry up. But this bush, the strange thing is not that it's on fire, but that the bush is not consumed. It is not being burnt up. It is not being destroyed. As he draws close to see what is happening, because God is there, present, to speak. And that bush that is not consumed, as well as drawing Moses' attention, acts as a sign. God is holy. God is just. God is the God who is the all-consuming fire. But it is possible for God's people to be in his presence, for God to be with us, bringing that holy fire, bringing his deliverance, and for us not to be consumed. That was going to be the promise to Israel. And there God commissions Moses. He sends him back to Egypt to go and tell my people, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Of course, Pharaoh resists. His heart is hardened. And at times the Israelites are very reluctant to trust Moses, his brother Aaron, who God has given as a spokesman to stand with him. So God sends these 10 plagues, river that turns to blood, the breaking out of boils and things on people's skin, the breaking out of gnats and frogs on the land, and then a darkness that falls. Notice a couple of things that are happening in that. First of all, the things like the Nile and the sun and the frogs and snakes and all those kinds of things that are there in the signs and there in the plagues represent and reflect Egypt's gods. God is showing that those gods are not real gods, that they are under his power and authority. Secondly, there's a loss of order. There is a retreat into chaos. There is decreation again. The final plague is the hardest. God tells Moses that the firstborn sons in Egypt will die. And that will affect the Israelites too, unless they do something crucial. So they're told to ready themselves for their journey, prepare bread, unleavened bread without yeast so they can prepare it quickly, and to cook a meal. At the centre of the meal is a lamb without blemish. And the blood for that lamb they are to sprinkle on their doorposts their houses, so that when God's angel comes, bringing judgment, bringing death, it will pass over the house. To this day, the Jews commemorate that day, that event, that evening with the Passover meal. And of course, it's the Passover meal that Jesus eats with his disciples before his death, and in effect says that this is no longer about that past event, but about what he is about to do, that he becomes the Passover lamb. He becomes exactly what that Passover is pointed to, so that it will be his body given, his blood shed. The Passover is in effect a covenant. The blood sprinkled symbolizes that covenant, God's mercy to his people. The people leave Egypt that night. They get to the Red Sea, and they are faced with this great sea of water. The Egyptian army pursue after them. They are trapped by two sources of death. The army behind, the sea in front. They're afraid. But God tells Moses to reach out, to stretch out, to hold out his staff over the water. And God sends a mighty wind that separates the waters and builds up these banks of water, miraculously holding them up. And the people are able to pass through on dry land. They pass through the waters of death. 1 Corinthians 10 will describe this as being baptized. And then when the Egyptian army pursue, the waters collapse back down and they are drowned. And the Israelites are able to celebrate on the other side with Miriam leading the dancing. Then God leads the people through the wilderness. When they get thirsty, he provides water from a rock for them to drink. When they are hungry, he provides food. Quails that fall from the sky. Bread-like substance, something called manna. Literally, what is it? We don't know. It's provided each morning with the dew. God provides, God protects, so that the Israelites are protected from enemies that attack, and God rules. So God summons Moses up a mountain, Mount Sinai, and there he gives them the law, the Torah, summed up in what we famously know as the 10 Commandments. And the Israelites learn to declare, behold, the Lord your God is one. You are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. But along the way, in different ways, the Israelites experience tempting and testing. And what frequently happens is they grumble and they complain against Moses. So that when we see Jesus in the wilderness, he is effectively retracing the steps of Israel. 14 days and nights of tempting to reflect their 40 years of testing. But of course, Jesus actually answering with words from that time, words from the law, is without sin. He is the obedient Son. Because Matthew takes up the words of the prophet Hosea 11 verse 1, where it says, out of Egypt I've called my son, looking back to Israel as God's son called out of Egypt through the Exodus, but actually applying it forward specifically to say Jesus is the true and better Israel, the true and better son, called out of Egypt. Well, the journey is meant to be a short one, about 11 days. But in fact, it takes them 40 years to arrive in the land, because when they get to the border, they refuse to go in. They send spies, and the spies come back and say this land is lush. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. There are massive clusters of grapes. There's food more than you can want, but there are great giant cities and there are giant people. The people are afraid. Joshua and Caleb, two vital characters of this time, try to persuade them to keep going. Then God says they cannot enter, and so they are forced to wander in that wilderness for 40 years. I suspect there would have been a sense of not just that they keep marching around in circles, but a sense of that reflection of scattering with some central points and things that they keep coming back to, and they are tested all the more during that time. On one occasion, there's this guy called Balaam, and he seems to have some kind of prophetic gift, but he's not one of the Israelites. He's not a prophet of God. And one of the opposing kings that wants to oppose them tries to pay him to curse the Israelites, but he can't. And so he encourages the Midianites to entice the Israelites to send in their women to seduce the men so that they commit sexual immorality, but also get drawn into pagan worship. There seems to be this pagan orgy that is happening. In the middle of that, a couple of things happen. There's a guy called Phineas who is so zealous, he has a zeal for the Lord in his house that he puts to death an Israelite and a Midianite as they're in the act outside the temple meeting. God sent a plague, and people were dying. And then when they call out to God for mercy, God gets Moses to make an ornamental serpent, reflecting the serpents that are coming and biting and bringing the plague. And so it's hold it up, lift it up, so that the people look to it, they will be saved. Jesus will echo that when he says, if I be lifted up on the cross, I will draw all people to me. Eventually the time comes for the people to go into the land, and on the border of the land, Moses, this is the very briefest summary of the book of Deuteronomy, retells them the Torah, the law. Deuteronomy means a second telling of law. He recapitulates, he retells the history, he retells the law, he gives much more detailed explanation, and at the end he sets out a ceremony to renew the covenant. When they go into the land, they are to pass through a valley, and there are two mountains, and on one mountain they are to shout out God's blessing, and on the other they are to shout out and remind the people of the curses. But they are to choose the blessings of God by being faithful to him, blessings of living in the land. But if they reject God and his covenant, then the curses of death, of pestilence, of war, and of exile will come. Now, Moses, although he's led the people 40 years leading into about 120 now, isn't he? He has been amongst those that in different ways have sinned. And so God tells him, you're going to see the land, but you won't go in. And so Moses looks into the land, but then God takes him. God buries him, so we don't know where he was buried. And the baton is handed on to a man called Joshua. Jesus tells us that he came not to abolish but to fulfill the law, to fulfill it by obeying it, so that he is the obedient son, the obedient Israel, so that his righteousness is applied to us. And the New Testament will frequently talk about how we were dead in our sin. We were dead and we were in exile, but we were people far off. And God has brought us to life and brought us near, so that just as God brought the people of Israel out of Egypt with a strong and mighty arm, so God delivers us from the strong men of death and sin. The strong man of death and sin of Satan. Next time we will see what happens when the people go into the land.